All right, let's start looking at making changes to our data frame. So we're going to do some stuff with a little bit of renaming columns and indices, as well as adding and deleting data from data frames. All right, so there are times when you want to rename your indices. Or the variable, field, column, want to maybe rename those, put different names in there. We're going to continue to work with the sales file. From 6/30/2021 and import that. So let's do this. So let's import pandas, bring the data frame in, and change the sales date. Okay, great. So now after looking at the column headings, I like the names, but for illustration purposes, let's change a column heading. And let's change the column heading for inventory ID to SKU. Okay, let's change that. All right, it's pretty simple to do. So we're going to go, here's our data frame, DF, rename, just that simple. And we want to rename the columns, and the columns equal curly brackets, inventory ID, and we want to change that by putting a colon in there to SKU. And we suggest that in place equals true. So it's just going to replace the same where the same ones are in the same place. So we're just going to change inventory ID to SKU. So let's see what this looks like. So now this data frame should now look like SKU, store brand description, if I did this correctly. So let's run this. And there it is. It's now changed to SKU. So it's a very easy way to replace your column names. And we can go in info, get the info, and just also see how that's now changed, right? So data column 0 is now labeled SKU, and it's still an object. We can do the same thing with indices. Code's a little different. We're not going to change the indices because it's 13.5 million of them. I'm not going to do that. But you can do the same thing, do a similar thing, do the same with indices. The code is, and here's the code for it, df rename, not columns, but index, and again, put the brackets in there. What's your existing index? And what's your new index? And the same in place equals true. Now, if we did this, I'm going to read df back in again. if we did in place equals false, and I haven't done this before, so I'm going to figure out what this is really doing here. If in place equals false, when I run this line, I'm just waiting for this to read in again. And I may as well get the date in there as well. Might as well run that. No, I did it twice. Okay. In place equals false. I wonder what this is going to look like. So we're going to run this. Okay. And so now what I have is in place is false. So I have column ID. What happened to the SKU? Right? If I run dfinfo, inventory ID, I don't see SKU. I don't see it at all. So in this case, I do need to put in the true if I really want that to be replaced. And so now I see SKU as a replacement. I can run dfinfo, and I can see that SKU is in there. All right? Okay. All right, now what happens? Okay, we figured out we've renamed our columns correctly and indices. What happens? There may be data that needs to be deleted or data you want to add. We use the same method as renaming columns or indices. Instead of rename, .rename, we use .drop if we want to delete items, right? We use .drop. In this next example, we are going to drop the first 1 million indices and vendor name and vendor number, and save these changes to a new data frame, and we're going to label it DF1. There is no rationale, no rational reason to drop this data. I'm just doing this. This is just for illustration purposes. The business question drives whether or not we drop data or drop variables. Okay? So dropping a variable, well, if I didn't want to go through and say, give me a new data frame with just these 4 variables, I could also just say, hey, can you drop these other 10 variables and do it that way? So whichever way you want to do it. All right. So let's take a look at and create df1. So df1 is going to be equal to df drop. And I'm going to do it in 2 different ways. First, well, I'm going to do it in 2 steps. One, I'm going to get rid of the indices, the first 1 million observations. So I want to get rid of a range from, and I've got, that shouldn't be in there. I got too many parentheses. A range, I want to go from 0 to million. And if I wanted to do every second item or every third item, I could also put in a step function, right? That do every third from 0 to 1 million. And this is along the this is along the x-axis, or along the 0 axis. So 0 axis is the rows, axis 1 are the columns. Okay, so this is along axis equals 0. Okay, so we think about axis 0 is rows, axis 1 are the columns. Because if I did 0 to 1,000,000, it would get rid of all of my data. It would get rid of all the columns. Right? So we're gonna run that, do that one. I'm also gonna do another df1, a new df1, where I'm gonna drop vendor name and vendor number, right? So if I knew what the numbers of those were, and I do, I could do 12 and 13. So drop we'll go range 12 to 13, see if that works. And this is going to be axis equals 1. Okay, I think that should work. This is saying it's not going to invalid syntax. Well, let's try that, see if it likes that. It seems to like that better. So, all right, so let's see if this, and then I could also do the same get rid of columns and put it into, spell it out, vendor number and vendor name, comma, axis equals 1. All right, so that should also work. So let's try it. Let's do df1, right? We're looking at kind of what df1 is going to look like compared to this. We're getting rid of the first 1,000,000, so you can see I got 12, 568, 238. Beautiful. Let's do df1 where I'm going to have all of the items, but I'm going to get rid of 2 columns. No, it did not like that. Did not like that list, right? So I haven't quite figured out how to do that. That's okay, but let's at least run this one and let's see if it works. That seemed to work. Got rid of those 2 particular columns. So I haven't quite figured out how to call up just a number within that indices. So we can do it by just putting in the name, right? And we can run df1 info. We can run that and have an idea about what we've got here. All right, so I've got df info, I've gotten rid of vendor number and vendor name. All right, so can we do it all at the same time? Well, let's create df2 where we are going to df drop index equals range from, I'm going to get rid of the 1,000,000. I think I did that right. Let's see. 1, 2, 3. 1,000,000 to 2,000,000. And comma columns equals vendor number and vendor name. Okay, so, and this is on this is axis equals 1. All right, let's see if that will work. So now we're creating df2. I'm going to get rid of a range of values, and I'm going to get rid of those 2 variables. So let's look at df2. df2, 12, 568, 238. So I got rid of 1,000,000, and I got rid of 2 variables. So that's how you can do it at the same time. Now, in this second example, code does it simultaneously. This becomes a much more complicated structure, right? So for me, I'm okay with more lines of code. I am a fan of more lines of code. That are simple versus complex lines of code. Again, it just makes it easier to see what you're doing. It makes it easier to see what you're doing. All right. In the next video, in part 2 of this, we'll get into how do you add data to a data frame.